from a West Coast perspective, all four of the West Coast teams in the Big Ten will have a new starting quarterback from what they had at the beginning of last year. Now, USC and Washington both, made the switch towards the end of the year, and those guys should, have the leg up this year. But there's going to be a lot of new faces for A, those four teams, and B, for all their opponents that they're going to play in the 2025 season.
It's kind of amazing. Like, you're preparing, and Jim and I did a ton of prep for this one. So if you're a quarterback fan, this show is for you. Obviously, the conversation with Max, but in addition, a deep dive into Big Ten quarterbacks in advance of spring ball, and some have already begun spring practice. But as I started thinking about it, Jim, I'm like, this isn't just for the fans of the Big Ten, because some of these quarterbacks we will reference today, a year from now, maybe even a month from now, might be on your favorite team in the Big 12, in the Pac-12, in the ACC, you name it. That's just the nature of the game. And I think for me, Jim, I've had to just accept that. I had never had a problem when quarterbacks transferred to go play. I've always been cool with that. I think we're now in an era where quarterbacks are transferring, especially this year and the next couple months, they're transferring for what they perceive to be a better opportunity. I mean, look no further than Maryland and Wisconsin. Billy Edwards Jr. was Maryland's starting quarterback last year. And I could recall calling their final regular season game, their senior day. And I could recall talking to their head coach, Mike Loxley, and Billy Edwards, and both of them confirming he was coming back, including him. Like, it was done. You're the starting quarterback. We're not going to make a move in the portal. We have a big-time high school quarterback in Malik Washington, who we met at Elite 11 last year, but you're the guy. And then a couple weeks later, I should argue, he's at another school within the same league at Wisconsin. And now, after the time we're recording this, they just had 1 or 2 spring practices. Everything I read about him, he's easily running with the ones, which makes sense because guys are getting paid a lot of money to run with the ones. That's kind of how it works now in this era of college football. But I would have never have thought that would have happened. So who knows who we talk about today may end up on your favorite team. So let's go there. And Jim, I look at these QBs in this league, and really any league, in really 3 buckets. And we're going to put a ton of time into bucket number 1. Bucket number 1 is the development within a system. And the question is, does it matter? Does it matter when you're in a system for more than a season? I think the obvious answer would be like, yeah, it's great. But then you look at Dylan Gabriel, and he went from Oklahoma to a totally different system and found himself in New York City. And most recently on this podcast, and now he's traveling all over the country, interviewing with NFL teams. Bucket number 2 is obvious. Right? Everybody writes about this. It was just a nice piece in The Athletic from Antonio Morales around the top transfer quarterback. So that's like Fernando Mendoza. Goes from out here in the West, the Cal Bears, does great, 98 yards with my boys, doesn't play in their bowl game, and then finds himself now in Bloomington following Curtis Rourke's footsteps with our dear friend Mike Shanahan, hailed to Pitt, former Pitt wide receiver, and now offensive coordinator, of course, for his second season at Indiana. And then the third one, we referenced Malik Washington at Maryland, is the freshman who can impact. Bryce Underwood will be that. We'll do a deep dive on the freshmen, on the transfers after a spring. Let them get a shot to actually take a snap before we start ranking or deciding who's who. I am not a fan of, you know this well enough, Jim, now I'm not a fan of anybody telling a player who they are. So we're not going to do that either here. We're not going to decide what people are before they've even taken a snap. So we will put some energy into players who are coming back into the same system for more than one season. So, Jim, for you, I'd be curious, what do you think about the concept of development within the system and it being an anomaly in the world of college football that we're in right now?
I mean, it really is. But when you look at it, at least for this year, and you think about the top quarterbacks in this conference, at least from where we're at right now, like you said, we'll know more as things start to develop. But the guys that you've seen with your own eyes playing in those uniforms for those coaches, like you can actually tell, like, okay, I know what this guy is, and I can see what this guy is. I mean, you've got 2 of what could be, at least for now, 2 of the top guys and all the quarterbacks in the country. When you look at a guy like Drew Allar at Penn State or Luke Altmaier at Illinois, because you've seen them progress. And, even Todd Blackledge talked about this on our last show. of wanting to see where these guys take that next step. So I think there's so much, there's such an advantage on the continuity of it. It's not just about, okay, well, it's the same quarterback from last year, but having the same guys around you, that has the same staff around that. You're not learning a new playbook. You're not learning new verbiage and all the rest of that, everything else that you have to go through. So that part of it just makes it so much simpler, where you can just go and basically kind of go end ball out.
Yeah. So I'm going to give you my thought on spring ball, and then we'll dive into these returning quarterbacks. I am an obsessive fan of spring football. Here's why. I'll take you through the player lens. I remember hearing this story. Very few people will know the name that I'm about to say, but a guy by the name of Mark Ponko, who is like a 4-year starter at Pitt as a strong safety. He was one of the early guys I met when I was a freshman, and he was also a walk-on turned scholarship player. And he said, Yogi, nothing is more vital than your first spring on campus. Why? Because the coaches are evaluating, do I need to replace this guy when I go out and recruit in May? It's a little different now, but there is another 10-day portal window at the end of April. So this spring is vital, whether you're young, whether you're new, whether you're a vet. And for the quarterbacks in a market that is very small, it was not an elite transfer market this offseason. I've talked to many coaches at powerhouse teams across the country this offseason. I said, why didn't you go get a guy in the portal? And they're like, well, it wasn't like it was loaded with players. So you have who you have. And that's why we want to double down here today on talking about the development. So let's talk, you referenced Drew Allar. Coming off a tough game against Notre Dame in the semifinals, I thought Penn State would win. I've been a Drew Allar fan since his time at Elite 11. I think he's got as natural of arm talent as anybody in America. He's had some challenging throws, though, and I think it's fair to say that. He's also had some challenging moments, whether it was in games against the Michigans and Penn States of the world, or whether it was against Notre Dame in the semifinal. But he also had brilliant moments, like Penn State on the road at the end of the season to really solidify them going to the Big Ten title game. He had moments where he bounced back in the Big Ten title game, and there's a world where you think they're going to get romped, and here comes this ferocious comeback. And I want to say that I believe at this position, you need to have scars. I've said that ad nauseum here. You need to have gone through adverse moments. Drew Allar has done that. Yes, he's a huge recruit. Yes, everybody at Penn State loved him when he showed up, but he had difficult moments. Look no further than a post-game press conference where he wears it on himself. That's why I can't wait to see him come back with Andy Kotelnicki in his second season and Danny O'Brien as the quarterback coach. I cannot wait to watch not only his confidence grow, but the details within his craft grow and the receiving core grow. Gone is Tyler Warren. In comes Kyron Hudson from USC. I think he'll be their number one wide receiver once we get to the season. He's a true vet. He's the guy who made that insane catch against LSU in the opener. It feels like many moons ago. But I'm a fan of Drew Allar. I get it. He's got to play better in the biggest moments. But I think you learn from those. He's still young in his career, so I'm all in on Drew. Luke Altmaier is an interesting story. This is a guy who transferred from Ole Miss, and I go to his coordinator, Barry Lunney Jr. To me, he is in the coaching circles as highly regarded as a play caller as I think you're going to find. He's in that top 1 or 2%. When you talk to coaches and you talk about Illinois, it's, oh man, Barry Lunney, watch how he calls games. So I went back and watched a bunch. It's a really creative style in which they call this offense. It's going to be physical. You have Brett Bielema with an offensive line background, obviously. They're going to run the football, but I think Luke is going to have an opportunity to continue to grow and evolve. And I love that he came back. Completion percentage was not high. And I believe you got to have two things in the room: competitive temperament and a high completion percentage. And he had some pretty talented wideouts last year. Can he take that next step? I think that he will. To me, Illinois is like the Indiana of this year. They're the darling. They can be a 10, 11, 12 seed in the playoff. I love their schedule. Among everybody in the Big Ten, I think I love their schedule the most for them and them moving forward. So I think those two, as the vets, they stand out immediately for me. And then probably in that same category, I go Ethan Kaliak-Manis. Coming back to Rutgers. Not going to impress you in shorts and a t-shirt necessarily. Probably won't even impress you dramatically on the field unless you really study him. And that's what I love doing, because I think he has the trait that we've talked about many times that I learned from David Shaw on the show, which is discernment. Knowing where the ball needs to go is equally as important as putting it in the right location in terms of a spot throw. And then as you double click on him, 26 drops on the season from Rutgers wideouts or skill players last year. 26. Nebraska had 7. Penn State had 20. So can they clean that up at wide receiver? His completion percentage was down, but put context around it. I'm looking forward to watching him under Kirk Shiraka in another season. Remember, he was a transfer from Minnesota last year, had that first full season, and now he gets another spring in away Rutgers goes. They were the sexy pick last year. They won't be that this year, but don't be shocked if Greg Schiano gets that program growing again. So I'll take a pause there. But those are my 3 guys at the top in terms of like real veterans within a system, age-wise, class-wise, and I think the opportunity they have to impact this coming year.
Yeah, 2 quick funny things on that. I mean, one, if Kelly Mackins doesn't transfer from Minnesota, are we even talking to Max Brosmer today? Like,
right. So
what happens in that respect? Because that's his transfer there is what opened up that spot for this transfer. So who knows? And on a similar note, like, who knows what was real at the time, but Drew Allar kind of said, yeah, I'll be back next year. But then heading into that Notre Dame game, there was a lot of like smoke around. Who knows? Maybe if he has a good, if he plays really well, that maybe he changes his mind and puts his name in the draft because his stock would raise up enough. But to your point, and I think even thinking back to like when we had Mark Sanchez on and, with, dealing with that adversity, how does he deal with that stuff? Him coming back this year, he could catapult himself well above where he would have been with just having a good game against Notre Dame to put himself in that draft scenario. So that I think that's going to be really interesting this year. Hopefully he doesn't try and wear that every game, that expectation like, oh, I need to do this to up my draft stock. But I think he's going to be a really interesting one to watch because of that.
Yeah, I think in history, you would often see a guy like Drew leave after last year. Because, age-wise, eligibility-wise, or like, hey, I just been through a ton here. Let me just kind of move on. And you're not. And part of that is the era we're in now with, of course, guys getting paid. But I think also way bigger than that, it's what he's returning to. I mean, Andy Kotelnicki is so impressive. You would love him, Jim. I mean, he's like a D3 coach and who's just skyrocketed, right? It was Buffalo, Kansas, now Penn State. I mean, he's a guy's guy in terms of you could just connect with him. He's as easy of a communicator as there is. James Franklin, same deal. I've known Coach Franklin for over a decade now as a Pennsylvania guy. Shout out to East Stroudsburg, I believe, is where he went, which is always fun. So I'm excited for them, and I love their room. I think of all the rooms in the Big Ten right now, it's intriguing. Yeah, Drew, you lost Bo Prabula to Missouri, to your point. Drew says he's coming back. I mean, a ton was made about this around the playoff. Bo didn't play in the playoffs, sadly, because the NCAA is just whack in terms of the rules and regulations and around the calendar on this. He has to leave. This guy had an impact on every game. And you're right. Like, you're thinking, like, okay, if Drew balls, is he going to dip? Well, they've got Ethan Grunkmeyer. They have Jackson Smolik, 2 Elite 11 alums, who I'm a huge fan of. Jackson finally going to get healthy. Like, I like the room there, and it's just a healthy environment. And I don't think, to your question of like, will he carry and harbor the burden of I got to play perfect every week? I think when you go through stuff, like especially what he's gone through on the stage and at that program, I think you actually get a case of like, all right, man, like now my shoulders can really drop. Like, I don't have to worry about living up to anybody else's expectations. And I think from going through what he did on such a big stage, we all thought they were going to the Natty. Like Penn State, Notre Dame, I'm picking Penn State again today if they have to play. And they didn't meet the moment, and Notre Dame did, and the style of play, and we all recall like what their quarterback Riley Leonard did, etc. So that's Penn State, though. That's Drew Allar. The next tier for me, I think, is a really interesting one. So I'm going to go Aidan Chiles and Dylan Raiola. Dylan Raiola, as big of a quarterback recruit as there's ever been in recent history at Nebraska. Uncle coaches there. Dad was an all-everything, turned NFL player there. Matt Rule is there. They also did something that we don't see. I don't know if I've ever seen this. I have to rack my mind, Jim. Maybe something will jump for you. But last season, we called the UCLA-Nebraska game. UCLA beats Nebraska on the road. And the next week, Marcus Satterfield is no longer the primary play caller. And in comes like a blast from the past, and Dana Holgerson And now he's the full-time offensive coordinator. Glenn Thomas is the quarterback coach. You've known Glenn for a long time. He was ASU OC back in the day. He was with the Steelers, been in the NFL. I mean, I'm a huge fan of him. But it's year 2, but it's really kind of like year 1.5 because of when he got the system and how he learned the system. It's a totally different system than the one he was playing in under Satterfield in terms of like a little bit more, generally speaking, like pro-style-y versus clearly air raid is the tree that Dana Holgorsen comes from. But I think it's the mentality that Dana Holgorsen has that I think is going to be really beneficial to Dylan Raiola. We'll see it in the spring if you're there for practice. They were not going to, notably, as we all know now, Nebraska, many others will not have a spring game that you'll see on television. But I think he'll make a big jump. And I think the edge of the air raid is what is often misconstrued. We all think the air raid is a scheme. And I've done deep studies on this. It's I did a podcast with Ted Robinson a long time ago. It's on our YouTube channel here, like The Art of the Air Raid. It's not a scheme. It's a philosophy. It's a mentality. You have to have a gravitas, confidence, dare I say, arrogance about you as a play caller and a quarterback, right? You're not a coverage scientist. You're feeling it and you're ripping it. I can't wait to watch Dylan do that this season. I bet he cleans up his mechanics a little bit. And I think we all have to accept that he was a freshman. And freshmen have to navigate just being freshmen. Yeah, he balled out early on in a couple games and then struggled for a lot of games and then found great success at the end of the season. And that's what it is at that position, folks, especially as a first-year player. So now under Dana Holgorsen, I cannot wait to watch him. And then here's Aidan Chiles. We all know him on the West Coast, right? He went to Oregon State, got a little bit of PT behind DJ Uiagalelei. Jonathan Smith leaves to be the head coach at Michigan State, as does Brian Lindgren. Here comes Aidan Chiles, and we think he's got a chance to be one of the best quarterbacks in the league last year. And he just kept turning it over. And I go back to that first-year starter thing. It's just your first time. And I think that he wore the weight of, that team or his expectations. I look forward to that, like, kind of balloon being punctured a little bit, Jim, and him coming back and playing clean, efficient football. We would see it in spurts. We just never really saw it in totality. We know John Boyer, who's the quarterback coach, and Brian Lindgren and Jonathan Smith really well. He's going to play really efficient football. I just believe it. I really do here in his second season as a true starter. He's going to have to because the pressure there can get cranked up pretty good. But I think he's got the pieces around him to allow him to have a lot of success as a returning starter in the same system. Third year in the system as well. This isn't just second year or a year and a half like Dylan Raiola is. This is third year in the system for him. He needs to showcase mastery around it. I think that he will.
Yeah, and he was the one that, and I'm not putting this on him, but he was the one that would really, I think, took a lot of the brunt of leaving Corvallis. Like, as upset as the fans were about Jonathan Smith leaving, I feel like they were even more upset about Aidan going with him. Like there was okay, coach is leaving, but we still have Aidan here. We can build around him. And then once he was gone, it was just that was the real dagger. So I don't know if maybe he wore that a little bit to that same extent. But obviously a ton of talent there from a guy that, was a real late bloomer, which is why he wound up at Oregon State to begin with.
Ready, set, dream cabin nestled in the woods. Just 4 hours to go. New job halfway across the country. Butterflies before a first date. Wherever you go, 76 fuels all the ways you go, go, go.
Yeah, I think I was training camp there last year, and they were like, he just turned 19. Might have just turned, it was something crazy. I don't want to say he just turned 18, but I'm pretty sure it was 19. But he was always really young for his age, really, really young for his age. So let's go to the third tier, Jim. This is the tier of you're coming back in the same system, but you're really young in the system and relatively inexperienced, if not dramatically inexperienced. So that to me is Jaden Mayava. I just think of Kaluka every time I see Jaden. I saw him at the pro day earlier this week at USC, which was fun to be there, even in the rain. I feel like there's a thing in LA, Jim, it always has to rain on USC's pro days. So whatever, it was fun. But Jaden, he comes on back, right? To your earlier point, he overtook the starting job from Miller Moss late in the season. He had moments where I thought he was so vulnerable. I think it was the Nebraska game, post-game. It's a great interview clip. And he talks post-game to the sideline reporter. I forget who it was. excuse me, and he goes, sometimes I harbor plays. Sometimes I try to make up for a past mistake with one throw, and I have to be better there. And I just love that, because that is every quarterback in the history of mankind. Every quarterback ever been around has struggled flushing a play, right? Flush it, move on to the next one. Throw a pick six, can I move on to the next one, right? Throw a third down, potential completion, drive continuation play, flush it, can you move on? Most quarterbacks struggle there. Jaden admittingly did last year, but he found this ability to be resilient. Look no further than their bowl game against against A&M. It was huge, much like Miller Moss's game against Louisville the previous year and their bowl game. So I'm looking forward to getting over there in spring practice. They start up next week on spring break right now as you're watching this episode. So looking forward to him. He's clearly the guy there. And just want to put this out there. Last year in training camp, there were rumblings like he was making a move on the job. So it's not as though like he couldn't have played. He's physically imposing. He's a different type of athlete than USC has had, at least in a year, right? Caleb was kind of a freak in and of itself. Like he's just a different player than anybody. Is why he's one of the greatest of all time in college. But I'm looking forward to watching Jaden. And he's got an it factor to him. Like guys lean into him. They follow him. He navigated what was probably a really awkward circumstance with Miller Moss being benched. It felt as though a lot of the SC supporters were split. Should it have been Miller? Should it have been Jaden? So to navigate that as a first-time starter is not easy. But remember, he also has a whole year of experience at UNLV. Right? So I think he'll be able to hit the ground running. I expect that USC a much more favorable schedule. So we'll see how that spring plays out for them. Damon Williams Jr. at Washington. Jed Fish, Jimmy Doherty becomes the offensive coordinator and, of course, the quarterback coach as well. Damon, we saw him at the Elite 11 gym. He was a one-time, sorry to say it, but Arizona commit. He followed.
He's actually counts as a transfer because he was like enrolled for like 2 days or something like that. Yeah. So if you always look, it was like Arizona transfer portal, Washington. So
got it.
As silly as that is in today's college football, that's how the lineage of all that went.
Yeah, no offense to Arizona. We love Arizona, obviously. I'm going to call the UW spring game. I will not reference the transfer from Arizona, Damon Williams. It will not happen at one time because he didn't take a rep in practice for that school. But I love so many things about him. One, I'll just say his personality is infectious. He's got this smile that'll light up your TV screen wherever you're watching this thing. He's got a dual threat ability that is really dynamic. But most importantly, I think I want to remind the UW fans watching, he's a passer. He's a passer. He's not just a runner trying to throw. He has a chance to be the most impactful quarterback next year in the Big Ten. Why? Find any coach and say, what is the scariest thing for you to defend? They're going to say a dynamic dual threat quarterback who's really a dual threat. Not a guy who can kind of run. Like Jaden Mayava can kind of run. He'll pull it on his own read. He'll pull it on an RPO. Not the athlete that Damon Williams Jr. is. I mean, we'll do this by the end of the spring, but he might be the best athlete at that position in the league. And then you add in Jed Fish, who I love how he calls games, the offense they run, the offensive line they brought in, how they've supplemented or retained players on offense. You look at the coaches they added defensively, right? Former Purdue head coach Ryan Walters, now the defensive coordinator. Like, UW has a chance to make some noise this year. I think it's going to be very similar to Arizona's rebuild. Year one, not great, but competitive in every game. Year two, we start to turn the corner, and here we go into the junior year of Damon Williams. Look out, 2 years from now for UW, but I'm looking forward to him, and I think it's just kind of a unique situation for those guys. And then I got to go to Oregon and Ohio State, Jim. Dante Moore, we know he started a handful of games at UCLA. Austin Novosad hasn't started, but to me, he's a proven dude. And Luke Moga, who is a freaky athlete. I mean, just freaky athlete. I'll be there for their spring game on the Big Ten Network. Will Stein, of course, coaching that position. And then Ohio State. Julian Sain was a Elite 11 MVP, baller. Lincoln Kleinholtz, he got some burn early on, some blowout games. He's gotten it at time throughout his career. And now Brian Hartline becomes the full-time OC. And Billy Fessler, who's been a big Chip Kelly guy, gets elevated to be the full-time quarterback coach. I can't wait to watch because those guys know the system generally, right? I don't think a ton is going to change from Chip to Brian Hartline from a verbiage standpoint. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of carryover because it all stems from their head coach, Ryan Day. Well, no, I'll tell you more about that call in their spring game on April 12th, I believe, on the Big Ten Network as well. And then for Oregon, like, I think we all expected to be Dante Moore, but if you know Dan Lanning, he's going to let this thing play out. And I think all three of those guys could play in major college football. So we'll see if there's a domino effect of naming a starter on what it does to that room when spring ends.
Yeah, it was interesting because Mocha was kind of the guy in last year's spring game that really kind of like turned some heads. It was like, oh, this guy is going to be part of that conversation when Dylan Gabriel is gone. Obviously, we've seen Dante, what he did at UCLA, some up and down moments there, but you can definitely see the potential in there. I'm fascinated to see because I haven't really seen Julian Sayin do anything on a real level. So I want to see what this guy has because you see the highlights on social media all the time. They're talking him up as that next big thing, and just working a little backwards here to Williams with Washington. And I remember the first time watching him on the Army All-American Bowl. I guess it's a little over a year ago now, or whatever that was. And I was like, oh man, this guy's gonna be legit. Like, even though he's small, like he is exciting. And then obviously he was the backup for the majority of the season, and his reps would increase as the year went on. But the first time I really was like, all right, let me just thankfully it was the only game on at the time was the Sun Bowl, and watch him in that one. And like, he's a baller, dude. Yeah. Like he is really good. He plays with that swag about him. And I thoroughly agree with you. I think Washington is going to be a very interesting team this year, and Williams is one of the major reasons behind that.
Yeah, what was really cool doing this study, and we don't mean to leave teams out, but these are the guys that are coming back for a second season within the same system, and I think it's a really deep conversation. There will be this year's version of Max Brosmer, who we're about to talk to here in a few moments. It might be at Iowa, it might be at Michigan, it might be like I'm talking about, it might be at USC. Who knows? Sam Heward, he transfers in from Utah. Like, who knows what'll eventually happen based on injury, health, competitive temperament, etc. But I think overall, the biggest takeaway I have from diving into this is that the Big Ten with 18 teams, it's such a challenging league. Like, and I get it. Like, Kalen DeBoer and Lane Kiffin and Steve Sarkisian say the same deal in the SEC. And so would our dear friend Kenny Dillingham and Marcus Arroyo and Brent Brennan and Kyle Whittingham about the Big 12. And I'm sure Mario Cristobal and Pat Narduzzi and Justin Wilcox would say the same thing. Troy Taylor on the ACC. I just think as these conferences have grown, you really don't get a breather. And I think specifically for the Big Ten and I'd say the SEC, like they've separated. Like, I don't think you can ignore that, at least financially. Right, they've separated from the other leagues. They're driving the conversation. What at the quarterback position? I think it'll just continue to improve. Like, when I look back on my first year calling games in this league, two of the biggest takeaways were, one, limited possessions. I think we called 7 or 8 games, Jim, where there was 1 possession per team in the first quarter. I'm used to like 4. Like, that had never happened. Very rarely happened calling games out west in 16 previous seasons. That was takeaway 1. Takeaway 2 is the quarterback play was average. Like, it wasn't premier. Like, the best quarterbacks, at least through the first part of the season, were all on the West Coast. And I believe that, like, the quarterback rooms on the West Coast, the backups, would have started a lot of schools in the Big Ten. And to your earlier point, some did. Some did, right? Whether it was at USC or whether it was Washington. And I think the same would be said about Oregon and Justin Martin, the one time who started a little. Yeah, now he's at Maryland. So I think that as the league grows and as the strength of the league continues to grow and or separate, whether it's financially, spots in the playoff, however, like, there's a lot of takes on that. I get it. I think the quarterback position in the Big Ten over the course of the next 3 years is going to be the best it's ever been. I don't think we've ever said, look at the Big Ten quarterbacks, and that's their year. Like, the SEC had an era where that was it. The Big Ten's always had 1 or 2, right? C.J. Stroud jumps to mind for me. But now I think with these 4 schools on the West, the way the portal has grown, you look at Julian coming from San Diego, Carlsbad, to Alabama. He did the DeMond Williams there for a minute, and then at Ohio State and Columbus. Like, it's just going to keep growing and getting better. And I love that.